The British people have spoken, and the answer is we're out.
To leave the European Union.
Do solemnly swear.
Alternative facts are not facts.
W zgiełku i chaosie liczy się wiedza. To ona daje ci przestrzeń do myślenia. Polityka Insight. Dostarczamy wiedzę uporządkowaną i pogłębioną, a decyzje należą do ciebie.
Deputy Prime Minister Morawiecki, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to share with you some of my thinking about the future growth of Chinese economy. One of the most discussed issues in China in the world is whether China will be able to achieve its growth target in a certain 5-year plan, that is between 2016 and 2020, of the rate of 6.5% and above. And this growth rate is important for China because Chinese government committed to double the per capita GDP in China between 2010 and 2020. And to achieve that commitment, China will have to grow at 6.5% and above between 2016 and 2020. And this growth rate is also important for the world because after 2008 financial crisis, China has contributed more than 30% to the global growth each year. And we know the global economy has not fully recovered from 2008 crisis. If China can continue to achieve the growth target, China will be able to contribute 30% or more growth to the world. And 6.5% and above seems to be not a target so hard for China to achieve. Because since the transition from a planned economy to market economy started in 1979, China has achieved 9.7% growth rate continuously for 37 years. And so 6.5% growth is a 30% reduction compared to the trend in the past 37 years. However, there's a lot of concern about whether China will be able to achieve that. It was because from 2010, the growth rate in China has been decelerated year by year. Like in 2010, the growth rate was 10.6%, and then last year, the growth rate was 6.7%. And the downward pressure is still very huge. And many people explain the 6.7% growth last year was the lowest growth rate in China since 1990, in a quarter century. And not only so, it was the first time for China to experience that growth deceleration continues for 7 years. Because in the past, I say the average growth rate was 9.7%, but there must be some kind of business cycle, some kind higher than 10%, sometimes lower than 10%. But in the past, every time when China has some kind of deceleration for 2, 3 at most years, then the growth rate will pick up again. But this time, it was a continuous deceleration for 7 years already, and the downward pressure in the growth in China is still very heavy. So under this kind of situation, many people thought the reason for the deceleration in China was because of internal structural problem. For example, SOEs still contribute about a quarter to the Chinese economy, but the state-owned enterprises did not perform well. And people attribute that as one of the main reasons for the persistence in the deceleration. And the other reason, people argue the growth model in China is not sustainable because China invested too much, consumed too little. And they think this kind of model cannot be sustained. And certainly, some excess capacities exist in many sectors in China today. And all these kind of problems are so-called structural problems. We know that structural problems is not easy to deal with. And so people argue, if China would not address its structural problem, then China will continue to decelerate. From now, about 6.7%, people argue the growth rate in China may drop down to 5%, 4%, or some people even argue China will revert to the so-called normal growth rate of 3%. And if that happened, certainly it may trigger a lot of social, political tension in China. And so some people argue, well, China will have to carry out the structural problems, reform, but we know structural problem, reform, structural reform in the short run, in the long run certainly is good for the economy. But in the short run, may further depress the consumption and the investment in China, and causing the short-run growth to further drop. And under the kind of situation, it may also trigger social, political problem. And as a result, there's a lot of speculation regarding the coming collapse of the Chinese economy. And it was one of the main themes in the Davos last year. Well, as someone studied Chinese economy, certainly I admit China, as a transition economy, China has many, many internal structural problems. However, I think the main reason for the deceleration in the Chinese economy since 2010 was because of external issue, because of cyclical issue in the world. Because we can compare other emerging market economies like Brazil, Russia, and India. In 2010, China's growth rate was 10.6%, and 2016, 6.7%, as I just mentioned. But when you look, Brazil, in 2010, its growth rate was 7.5%. And in 2016, its growth rate was negative 3.5%. Just like China, deceleration, and a much sharper deceleration than China. Then Russia, in 2010, its growth rate was 4.5%. In 2016, its growth rate was negative 0.6%, similar to China, and a much sharper deceleration. How about India? India, in 2010, its growth rate was 10.3%. China, 10.6%, about the same level. And in 2016, India's growth rate was 6.7%. So the pattern is exactly the same as China. And they don't have those structural problems as China has, like large SOE in the economy or over-investment and little consumption. They have a lot of consumption and they do not invest as much as China. So there must be some other common external or cyclical problem to contribute to this kind of same patterns of growth in the past 7 years. And the best way to prove my position is to look into other high-income, high-performing, export-oriented economy in East Asia. For example, Singapore, one of the highest income countries in the world. In 2010, its growth rate was 15.2%. In 2016, its growth rate was 1.8%. So it was a sharp deceleration during the same period of time and a much sharper deceleration. We can also look into Korea. In 2010, its growth rate was 6.5%. In 2016, its growth rate was 2%. Again, deceleration and a much sharper deceleration than China. So there must be some common external or cyclical factor to contribute to the similar pattern of growth in so many economies in the world. And in fact, it's not so hard to understand. Because if you want to calculate the growth in an economy each year, its growth must come from three components. One is the growth in export. The other one is the growth in investment. And the third one is the growth in consumption. And we know that in terms of export, after 2008, the high-income country has not recovered from its normal growth. And as a result, high-income country consumption increased little and contribute to the slowdown in the global trade growth. Before 2008, we know the world growth was twice as high or even more than the global GDP growth. But after 2008, the global GDP growth reduced and the trade growth was even smaller than the global GDP growth. And that contributed to the slow growth in export from many other countries. And for example, from 1979 to 2015, the average annual trade growth in China was 15.4%. But 2016, last year, the trade growth in China was negative 2%, negative 2%. And this kind of pattern is similar to many export-oriented economies in the world. That was one of the main reasons for the slowing down in the growth rate in China as well as in many other countries in the world. And the second reason is investment growth. We know that when the world economy was hit by the 2008 financial crisis, triggered by the collapse of Lehman Brothers, every country adopted certain kind of expansionary fiscal policy to support investment as a way to stabilize the economy, to generate the job, and so on. And those kind of projects, after 5 years, 6 years, all completed. But the global economy has not recovered yet. And under this kind of situation, unless the government, adopt a new round of fiscal expansion to support investment, otherwise the investment growth will drop. And take China, for example. In the 11th five-year plan period, that was from 2006 and 2010, the average annual growth rate of investment was 25.5%. And in the 12th five-year plan period, from 2011 to 2015, the average annual growth rate of investment was 18.8%. It was about 7% drop in the investment growth. And last year, 2016, the investment growth rate was only 8.1%. And certainly, that contributed to the slow growth in China. And similarly, it also contributed to the slow growth in other emerging market economy or even export-oriented, high-performing East Asian economies. And then the last component is consumption. Consumption in China still grow relatively robustly. It was because of the income growth in China is still maintained quite high. Last year, the GDP growth rate was 6.7%, and the per capita GDP growth rate was 6.1%. But household income increased at a rate of 6.3%. And under this kind of higher household income growth, consumption growth in China last year was 8.1%. And that was the reason why China was able to maintain around 6.7% growth in last year. In other emerging market economy, their income growth was not as high as Chinese income growth, and the consumption growth cannot compete with China's consumption growth. And that was the reason why their growth rate dropped much sharper than the growth rate in China. So if we understand, certainly China is a transition economy. China has a lot of structural problems. China certainly needs to carry out the structural reform. But if we want to make a judgment about whether China will be able to achieve its growth target, we need to analyze the issue again from the three components of the growth to understand the possibility. And regarding the export growth, high-income country has not fully recovered yet. And according to the IMF, in the year of 2017, this year, the high-income country only average world growth at about 2.4%. And the US will grow at about 2.3%. That's less than 3% growth they used to have. And the Eurozone area, its growth rate is likely to be 1.6%. And Japan's growth rate will only be around 0.8%. So under this kind of situation, trade growth will still be subdued. And especially under the new administration in the US, there may be some kind of trend tension between China and the US. And under the kind of situation, certainly trade cannot be a main source of growth in China. So if we want to understand whether China will be able to reach its growth target, we need to identify the internal source of growth in China. The internal source of growth in China has two components. One is investment, and the other one is consumption. So we need to see whether China will be able to maintain reasonably high investment growth in 2017 and the coming years. For that, I think China still has many, many good opportunities. Because although we talk about the excess capacity in China, like in the steel sectors, cement sectors, aluminum sector, glasses sectors, and so on. But they are all in low value-added sectors. China still has a large potential to have industrial upgrading. For example, last year, China imported $1.2 trillion of manufacturing goods. Those kind of goods China could not produce, but means that China can upgrade to those kind of sectors. And this kind of upgrading requires investment, and those investment will generate good economic return and a social return. That is one potential area for investment in China. The second potential area for investment in China is infrastructure. If you come to China, you may be impressed by the infrastructure in China. And that's true. Compared to other developing countries, infrastructure in China is much better. But in the past, most of the infrastructure investment in China were to connect from one city to the other cities, like highway, high-speed train, airport, port facility. But inside the city, inner city infrastructure in China is still very poor. For example, subways, still insufficient, so traffic in China is very congested. And underground sewage is also underinvested. So whenever there's some kind of heavy rain, then the city will be flooded. So those areas are also good investment, both economically and socially. And the third area for investment is environmental improvement. In the past 37 years, the growth rate in China was very high, but the environmental degradation is also very serious. And certainly China needs to go through the green growth. But to have green growth, we also need to make investment in new green technology. And the last one is urbanization. Currently, the urbanization rate in China is 57% of the total population. But to become a high-income country, the urbanization rate will have to reach about 80%. So China is still on the process of urbanization. And when you move the people from rural areas to urban areas, you need to provide housing. That requires investment. You need to provide public service. That also requires investment. So China still has many, many good areas for investment that will generate how economic return and social return. And I'd like to mention, this good area for investment is something distinguishes China from other developed countries. Like in the US or in Western Europe, currently, they also need to make investment in order to generate demand. But they cannot find good investment opportunity because their industry are already on the global frontiers. And once they have excess capacity, it's very hard to find good investment opportunity. China is a middle-income country. China still can find many good investment opportunity. And also in a high-income country, in general, the infrastructure is ready. Although maybe old, but they don't have infrastructure bottleneck, like in a developing country in China. And their environment is good. Their urbanization has already matured. So in high-income country currently, it's very hard for them to find good investment opportunity. But China, there's plenty of good investment opportunities. And with good investment opportunity, you also need to have resources to make investment. For that, China is also in a good position. Because currently, the accumulated debt of the government, both the central government and local government, is about 57% of GDP, among the lowest in the world. And certainly, Chinese government can further expand the fiscal stimulus to support investment. And also the private saving in China is around 45% of GDP. So the government can use its investment to leverage private sector investment. When you make investment, you need to import raw material, equipment from abroad. And you need to have foreign reserves. China has $3 trillion of reserve, among the highest in the world. So China is not constrained by the resources for making investment. And this distinguishes China from other developing countries. Other developing countries, under current situation, certainly also would be desirable to make investment. And like to China, they also have many good areas for investment. But very often they are constrained by the government high deficit or low saving rate of the private sectors or lack of sufficient foreign reserve. So under this kind of situation, if the Chinese government utilizes its good investment opportunity and good resources for making investment, China can maintain reasonably high investment growth rate. With high investment growth rate, jobs will be created, household income will continue to grow, and household income grow, consumption will continue to grow. And with that, I think China will be able to achieve the growth target of 6.5% and above this year. And this kind of situation are not going to change in the coming few years. So I think China will be able to achieve the 6.5% and plus growth rate in the coming 4 or 5 years. And with that, China will be able to achieve its commitment of doubling per capita GDP from 2010 to 2020, by the time of 2020. And with 6.5% growth, currently, China's GDP is about 15% of global GDP. With 6.5% and above growth, China will contribute 1% growth to the world growth. And we know that the global growth is around 3%. So each year, China will continue to contribute more than 30% of the growth to the world. China will continue to be the engine of the growth in the coming year. Thank you.